So today, we're going to be the 15th Sunday after Pentecost. And if you noticed last Sunday, Tom, you were in church, Kathy, were you? Yeah, you were
Yes,
there.
I was in church.
You were there.
It's all a blur.
It's getting to be a blur all to me. So it's we're back into the Gospel of Mark for the gospel lessons. And we're also doing a very interesting, it's the time in the lectionary where we read from the letter of James, which is also very interesting. One of the interesting elements about the letter of James from an historical point of view is that Martin Luther wanted to excise the letter of James from the New Testament. He wanted to take it out altogether. And the reason being it didn't quite match his theology. So even one of the great reformers, was sort of starting to jury rig scripture to prove his point. It really isn't inconsistent with his theology, but he just thought that people would not understand how it was. And that's because the letter from James speaks quite strongly about works. And we all know that one of, Kathy, you were a Lutheran, so you were steeped in this, salvation by faith alone. And, all of that was a response, of course, in the Reformation to an overemphasis on religious observance by the Catholic Church, wherein, you had to do certain things and a certain way to obtain grace, and that grace would come through the sacraments and through your works.
Or your pocketbook.
To salvation. Go ahead, Kath. What did you say?
Or your pocketbook.
Well, that's true, yes. But that's part of work. So Luther was uncomfortable with James but James's thesis is thoroughly consistent with Luther, of course. But like I said, the emphasis just was not comfortable for him, because James talks about, he has a famous line in there that faith without works is dead. And if your theological banner says salvation by faith alone, suddenly, if you don't quite understand what James is talking about, people can start to use it against you. So that's historically, at least that's the, the anecdote about Luther. But James' letter really is a very important one for us as Christians because of that very reality that he talks about. How essentially what he's doing is arguing for the integrity of the Christian life. By that, what we mean is that by what we profess as our faith would actually result in would actually have practical results in our lives, so that we just don't speak only words of faith, but we actually do deeds that emerge from our faith. And therein is the consistency, that the faith comes first. But the idea that he's talking about is, in his day, that there was a, sort of a, how do I want to say this? It's not a Lutheran emphasis on faith, but rather a notion that if you just sort of turn and profess Jesus, then everything's fine. You don't have to change anything. And James was arguing against that. He said conversion is more than just of the mind. It also needs to be of the heart. And if it's the heart, then it's the will. And so if it's the will, it's what we do. So that's his logic within the letter. So that it's important for us to realize that, particularly, it's a very important emphasis in Anglicanism, and particularly in the Episcopal Church, because we do a lot of works, quote unquote works. A lot of our outreach, for example, a lot of people belong to the Episcopal Church because of the very deep social teaching patterns that we have relative to, Matthew 25, where we feed the poor, we clothe the naked, doing what in another context called the traditional works of mercy. And that this, as Episcopalians, we kind of need to know James thoroughly so that when people confront us about our about our emphasis on works, or because we're very sacramental, we do all these good things, and that we need to always tie it back to faith. So that essentially what James is saying is exactly what Luther was saying, that you need both. You can't have one or the other. And that faith without actually having a change in one's life is useless. It doesn't do anything. And works alone doesn't do it either. So what James said is, he says, show me your faith and I'll show you my works. And that's another way of saying faith without works is dead, because he's basically saying not that you're saved by works, but rather a phrase that we often use, the proof is in the pudding, that in the taste of it, so that in the actual appearance of our lives, that our lives need to manifest forth in a fleshly form what our heart and head faith teach us, so that it's very incarnational. It's very consistent with John. Actually, we've been talking about John and all of that, so that the whole idea of the life in the Spirit is not a life like in another world. It's a life in this world that is now being transformed by the Spirit of God. So that's why during this period of time when we read from James, that's important. So maybe today we'll just read the letter, and then we're going to go talk about the gospel. Maybe we'll come back to the letter. So I'm going to do a screen share here, and we're going to take a little journey from the homepage of the Formation website, St. Luke, or it's Journey in Faith -St. Luke's Lebanon.org. And here we go. There it is. That's the home page. When you go to this address that's up here, and then we click on menu and go to grow, because that's all of the instructional kind of thing. This part here is for younger kids and families. This, of course, is Godly Play. Some resources when we started the pandemic, some prayers for children, for the health crisis. The youth page, it's pretty much on hiatus until we can kind of start to gather again. Same thing with young adults. But here's the one I want you to look at, and that is for adults. And you will see here a link to lectionary text for this Sunday. Also, there's a page parallel to that with the children for prayers during the health crisis. We also have the summer reading list that you may have read about in the bulletin. And then, of course, there's all the resources for the Way of Love. Well, we did that in its adult form a couple of years ago. If you just click on the adult page, it takes you to this page here, which then has all that stuff here. So here's, for example, our Bible study. So if you ever need a link and you can't get to it, this is one of the places you can go to, or you can refer other people to. The adult forum material is usually here when we have one. Here's a reference to our discussion group. On this side is the summer reading list. Here is podcasts. We used to have the Way of Love podcast, but they're not doing those currently. So now we're inviting you to listen to the podcasts. And Kathy can tell you all about Deirdre Good, who is one of the principal speakers on that. Here she is. That's her name right there. And how dynamic and interesting she is. But we also have Dr. Joshua Davis, who also teaches at the Stevenson School, and Althea Miller, who is an assistant professor at Drew. So the four of them actually have, or three of them rather, have a conversation about the lessons. So that's a good podcast to look at. And of course, there's our stewardship page. And here's the stuff from the Stevenson School. So you can see what Kathy's up to these days. But if you need to go to the lectionary, you can go to the lectionary, go grow, adults, lectionary, and it takes you here. You're the lectionary text for each week. There's the 15th Sunday after Pentecost. If you want to download them to read them in a hard copy, print them out, you can download this PDF file. Otherwise, they're right here. So the first lesson is from Proverbs. We're not going to talk about that today, but here's the epistle. This is James. My brothers and sisters, do you with your acts of favoritism really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? For if a person with gold rings and fine clothes comes to your assembly, and if a poor person in dirty clothes also comes in, and if you take notice of the one wearing the fine clothes and say, "Here, have a seat, please," while to the one who is poor you say, "Stand over there," or "Sit at my feet," have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brothers and sisters, has not God chosen the poor of this world to be rich in faith and to be heirs of the kingdom that he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor. Is it not the rich who oppress you? Is it not they who drag you into court? Is it not they who blaspheme the excellent name that was invoked over you? You do well if you really fulfill the royal law according to the scriptures. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. But if you show partiality, you commit sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point has become accountable for it. For the one who said, "You shall not commit adultery," also said, "You shall not murder." Now, if you do not commit adultery, but if you murder, you have become a transgressor of the law. So speak, and so speak, and so act as those who are judged by the law of liberty. For judgment will be without mercy to anyone who has shown no mercy. Mercy triumphs over judgment. What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, but do not have works? Can faith save you? If a brother or sister is naked and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, keep warm and eat your fill," and yet you do not supply their bodily needs, what is the good of that? So faith by itself, if it has no works, is dead. So that's the core element. So there are a number of things going on there. We can come back to that if you like. But today, the focus will be on the gospel lesson, which is the gospel for this Sunday, this weekend. Jesus set out and went away to the region of Tyre. He entered a house and did not want anyone to know he was there, yet he could not escape notice. But a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit immediately heard about him, and she came out and bowed at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. She begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. He said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Sir, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And then he said to her, "For saying that, you may go. The demon has left your daughter." So she went home. She found the child lying on the bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and went by way of Sidon toward the Sea of Galilee, in the region of the Decapolis. They brought to him a deaf man who had an impediment in his speech, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. He took him aside in private, away from the crowd, and he put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. And then looking up to heaven, he sighed, and he said to him, "Ephphatha," that is, "be opened." And immediately his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Then Jesus ordered them to tell no one. But the more he ordered them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. They were astounded beyond measure, saying, "He has done everything well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." There ends the gospel lesson. Now, this lesson is an interesting one in that it is really focusing on a couple of very important themes in the Gospel of Mark that we've actually been developing way back before we got into the Gospel of John. And you'll notice the geographical region where Jesus is. If I had thought of it, I just thought of it now, I should have put a map up of where we're talking about. But Tyre and Sidon are sort of twin cities, and they're in what one might call the Gentile district of Palestine at the time. So he is really going into, in one sense, foreign territory. He's journeying into a place that is not observant of the law. So when he encounters this woman, Mark is very clear. She was a Gentile. She was Gentile in origin, or she was a Gentile of Syro-Phoenician origin. So basically Syrian or Phoenician, a combination of those things. So we're talking about the north end of Palestine down along the coast. That's where the Phoenicians were. The Phoenicians were an ancient seafaring people. They had a very developed culture. In fact, the Phoenicians are credited with the first real, setting down the first real kind of writing in terms of commerce. Because what they did, they're called runes. They're not kind of letters the way we're used to, but they're sort of these marks on a clay tablet. And they basically, the writings that they've discovered were receipts for, a load of oil or flour or grain or whatever, because they were basically the merchant marine of the region at one time. They would sail the close Mediterranean, they'd go up to Greece, they would go down to Egypt, and they would bring all of this material back to Palestine. So they were the traders, it's Traders, traders, not traitors. And they were the ones basically who were overcome when we talk about the Canaanites. This is a part of that area. So that Israel essentially, when the kingdom of Israel was established and unified, and Israel and Judah were unified under the reign of David, and then of course Solomon expanded it all, this area was part of that. And then in Jewish history, the northern tribes, the 10 tribes that inhabited what we call Israel, what was ancient biblical Israel, split off from what became ancient biblical Judah, which is in the south. And it was Israel, the 10 northern tribes that are called the 10 lost tribes, because basically they were eventually overcome by foreign forces, and their government system, their kingdom and all that was all destroyed, and they became a vassal state to Babylon and others. So consequently, and they never regained any kind of sense of independence or identity as Jewish peoples. And so consequently, what happened was, from an historical point of view, there was a lot of intermarriage between what were ethnically Jews or Hebrews and the sort of native peoples up in that area, which were like the Phoenicians and so on. So that whole area became unclean in some ways of thinking. So that's really the bottom history for this story, but also for another famous story that we know of, and that is the story of the Good Samaritan, because that's where Samaria was. Samaria was sort of plunked down in the middle. There was a part of Palestine that was still a little Jewish, and that was up where Galilee is, and Samaria was a more hostile area, and that was between Galilee and Judah in the south. And so there, people would go around Samaria rather than go through it. And so part of what the background of this is Jesus actually is daring to travel by taking the shortest route. He's taking the shortcut, which is through this Gentile land. So it's no wonder that he encounters a Gentile woman. Now, so this is notable on two scores. One, she's a Gentile, being of Syro-Phoenician origin. So we're even giving her ethnic identity. But also she obviously is a woman. And this was not to be done. And we've talked about this a little bit before. The Gospel of Luke is much stronger on the role of women, but Mark does begin to touch on it because I do think it tells us that this was a core teaching of Jesus. And that is that women had access to God, which in older Jewish thinking was women didn't have direct access to God. They had to go through their man. It was, that kind of culture. So here we have this woman coming to Jesus directly and pleading for a favor. Now, when we read this, it sounds extremely harsh. When Jesus says, "Let the children be fed first. It is not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." It sounds like, and indeed, he is referring to her as a dog. We use a different sort of coarse term in our culture, which we, what is the word for a female dog? Bitch, right. So, we take that word, which is a perfectly good English word all in itself, in terms of, identifying a female dog, but Jesus is using it almost as a coarse person in our culture might look at a woman and call her this pejorative term. He is identifying her with a dog. Now, we might say, well, what's so bad about that? We love dogs, aren't we? Puppies are cute and fuzzy and all of that. Well, in this day and age, and in particular in Palestine, and especially among the Jews, the Hebrew people, dogs were not kept as pets. They were scavengers. So basically, dogs ran wild, and what they did was raid the garbage, what we would say, raid the garbage cans to find their food. So the image of throwing the food to the dogs, there's a couple of things going on there. Jesus is talking about taking perfectly good food, which is suitable for human consumption, and throwing it to the scavenger dogs before humans have had a chance to eat it. So, there's that image that's there, that we sort of miss the nuance on that. And then, of course, he's referring to her obliquely as a dog. And who are the children but the people of Israel, the chosen, the people of God, the people who follow the law of Moses. So he's still maintaining this distinction between Jew and Gentile. That's why Mark makes the point that she was a Gentile woman. So not only was she a woman, but she was a Gentile woman. And Jesus sort of transitions then, actually, interestingly, from an almost traditional Jewish stance into one where he begins to look at things differently in the text and says essentially that her confidence in him and his capacity to heal is enough. In another place, you might hear it said, "Go, your faith has, not healed you, your faith has healed your daughter." So it's that kind of reality. That's why I kind of like talked about James for a little bit, because now we're talking about how faith manifests itself in our daily lives. So this woman is actually manifesting faith to Jesus by talking about his confidence, first of all, to heal her daughter, but also by identifying herself as Jesus would have identified her, as not deserving of the work of a Jewish rabbi, because she was a Gentile. So she says, I don't care. The important thing is my daughter. And the subtlety of that is that what Jesus is really recognizing there is the woman's love and concern for her daughter. Her love and concern for her daughter. So that she wants her daughter to be healed, and she will suffer any insult, any ignominy in order to get this. So she would, in one sense, we could say, she would pay any price. Now, I know we talked about some time ago, Karl Rahner's idea of anonymous Christianity, where we said if somebody has never been exposed to the gospel or the teachings about God, and yet they offer themselves up willingly to save another life, that act of self-martyrdom in some ways is in reality a testament to the work of Jesus, and so merits God's love and grace, and is a way into salvation. Now that might militate against what Luther might have said in terms of works and saving by works. But see, the idea is that the faith is there, that my faith, because faith is rooted ultimately in love, in trust, so that someone would offer themselves in exchange for another individual out of love for that person, out of self-giving sacrifice, which is the very thing we said Jesus accomplished on the cross. So this is the same kind of thing. This woman is basically, she's just been compared to a dog, actually her daughter as well. And Jesus is sort of going again through that kind of traditional Jewish way of thinking, and she stops him cold in a way, by, rather than being insulted and walking away or being discouraged and walking away, she's persistent, which is also an element of faith. And she says, I don't care what you call me. All I want is my daughter to be free of this demon. So Jesus then recognizes this and he says, by what you have said, in essence, what he's saying here, if we read it carefully, by what you have said, you have healed your daughter. You have healed your daughter. So it is really by her faith, her confidence, her trust in Jesus, that the work is being accomplished. So while, of course, we say Jesus was the miracle worker, Jesus was the one who did the healing, Jesus was the divine agent in that sense, it comes to practical reality because of the woman's faith, because of the woman's trust and confidence in what Jesus is and what Jesus can provide. Any questions or comments about that section? Tom.
Well, I always get these gospels wrong when I try to self-interpret them. But anyway, when I first read this and the preceding reading of the epistle, it seems like this story also brings out the whole concept of non-discrimination. And if you look at the symbolism of those dogs, I originally thought that while he was testing her to see whether or not she would believe, as he does, that even the least, namely the dogs, deserve to be served as well.
Wonderful. That's exactly true. So that is an insight from this lesson. I mean, so that's kind of what we were talking about. We were leading up to that by, making the case for, the fact that she was a Gentile and she was a woman. So those elements that were thought to be of no value in the living out of the law of Moses, and were sometimes seen, particularly being a Gentile, was seen as an obstacle to communication with God or sharing God's life, that this makes no difference to Jesus. this makes no difference to Jesus. And so, yes, it's the next logical step. In fact, that's what happens here, is that Jesus sounds like a typical traditional Jewish rabbi. And then all of a sudden, she does this thing, and his perspective actually changes. Now, we kind of read over it, we kind of gloss over that piece, but really, yes, was he testing her? Perhaps. But in fact, there are other people watching this. So the very fact that he said, go, what you've asked for from God is now being given to you, is itself overcoming those obstacles. And so Jesus is beginning to lay the case, or Mark is beginning, I should say, is beginning to lay the case through the works and words of Jesus, that ultimately Paul's message, which is relatively contemporaneous with Mark's writing of this gospel. When Paul in Galatians says, there is no Jew, there is no Greek, there is no slave, there is no free, there is no male or female, we are all equal before God. That Paul makes that explicit in his argument with, of all people, James, the apostle James in Jerusalem, over whether or not the Gentiles should be admitted to the church without first becoming Jews. That was the argument that he talks about in Galatians, and where Peter was. And of course, Paul goes and he argues with the elders in Jerusalem. And it's James that delivers the message. Yes, well, we have gone into council and we've discussed it. And yes, the Gentiles can be brought in without observing the law of Moses. But they must refrain from the blood of strangled animals, etc. There were 4 criteria there, but all of those had to do with idol worship in the temples. So that was the idea, is basically just don't worship pagan gods and you're fine. So that's all about the middle to the later part of the 1st century of the Christian era. So Jesus is already off the scene. Mark's writing his gospel, and Paul is doing his missionary work and writing his letters and telling the story, of which Luke will later on sort of tell the history in the book of Acts. But here we have the actual doing of Jesus' teaching. So this is going on in the minds of the early Christian church. This notion of, where do the Gentiles fit into all of this? And so that the idea being that no one should be kept away from the power and the work of God. So then when you read James, that first paragraph that we read this morning, he's talking about prejudice, really. And in that particular case, he's talking about, the sort of natural human thing that we do. We like people who have power and money. We just gravitate to them. That's a human trait. We're not attracted necessarily to needy people. We usually seek to avoid them. Those are the people, if somebody was walking down the street and they're nicely dressed and they seem to be, sort of middle class, that kind of thing, we don't cross the other side of the street to avoid them. Whereas if you got a panhandler on the corner, you may think twice about going by if you don't want to be accosted. There are people who do these things, and more frequently than we want to admit. Even good, quote unquote, Christian people do these things. So this is what James is speaking to, this very reality. Thank you, Tom. That's very, very helpful and exactly where we needed to go. Yeah.
I have to go now. So
okay. Well, you got your shot in there. So that's good.
All right. Good day, everybody.
All right, you too, Tom. Take care.
Take care.
Now, the second paragraph from this reading is about the deaf man that Jesus heals. And similarly, he is in the region that is called the Decapolis, which simply put means 10 cities. And again, this is in the area that is not particularly favorable in terms of Jewish religious practice. And so he's again taking sort of a shortcut And he works this miracle directly on this man. Now, we're not told what this man's identity is, whether he's Gentile or Jew. And, but the presumption is that he's probably not, one of the Pharisees for sure, or the scribes or any of those people. In fact, this is another issue of the kind of prejudice we were referring to before, because someone who could not hear, who was deaf, or someone who was mute or had a speech impediment, that was one of the ways that demon possession was manifested. So these two stories are not unrelated. So that the thought was, if you had some sort of illness, well, what we call it illness. Now, George, this is up your alley, being an ENT. That not being able to hear, not being able to speak, which often is associated with poor hearing or deafness, that in fact that was seen in the time of Jesus to be a mark of the devil, in that sense, that demons possessed this individual. So but it's interesting to see what he does. Now, he was just kind of coarse with this woman, wasn't he? You can't take the food from the children and give it to the dogs, the children being the children of Israel. Well, now he does something quite contrary to that. He takes this man, interestingly, and he takes him over to the side. It says that he takes him over to the side. He's not doing this thing for show. That's part of what Mark is getting at here. This is not being done for show. This is being done out of compassion for this man and what he is suffering from. And again, since the common understanding at that time would be that this is all about demons of one sort or another, little gremlins, as it were, residing in our ears or in our tongue, that that Jesus is actually doing what he just did for the Syrophoenician woman. He is casting out a demon. He is casting out a demon. That's what brings the healing. Now, you've heard me refer to William Barclay lots of times, and because there's some interesting details in this story that make us think a little bit. I didn't have that resource with me, so I couldn't really look it up. But this is one of the miracles he talks about, along with the miracle of the healing of the blind man, where Jesus actually does something kind of medical. It's kind of weird, from our point of view, what he does. It says that he put his fingers into his ears, and he spat and touched his tongue. That somehow taking his own saliva and putting it into the mouth of the man would release his tongue. Now, some people would want to say, well, that's because it's Jesus' saliva. He's the Son of God, and it's got some special properties. Well, that's superstition. But there must have been, again, if I had Barclay at hand, I probably would be able to find it. A lot of what we see in the healing miracles is a little bit of folk religion being employed as an instrument of healing. So notice, he puts his fingers into his ears. Well, okay. I don't know, George, but that help any?
That's the whole reason I went into otolaryngology.
There you go.
I watched the very same thing.
Okay. And of course, then spitting, into his tongue. Now, in the really old rituals of baptism, we go back to the baptism of infants, or more adults too, but back into the Middle Ages and prior to that, and up into the Catholic Church until the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, that was actually one of the things you did. Is before the child was baptized, there was this sort of mini exorcism that went on. And one of the things you did was take this, and then the priest stuck his finger into the child's mouth very quickly. Of course, it's infants, so probably no teeth available. And, so not worried about getting bit. but it's a little unhygienic from our point of view in the modern age. And then he said the words, "Ephata," be opened, all symbolic of this very story, where the whole idea is once you're baptized, you will be able to open your mouth to the praise of God and sing the praises of God. I mean, that's sort of the baptismal context for that. And then there was also a ritual of touching the ears. You didn't stick your finger in them, but because they were too small, probably. But you actually touched the child's ears. In the rites of Christian initiation of adults, these very same things happen to catechumens. But we don't spit into somebody's mouth, but we touch the ears, we touch the mouth, because these are forms of ritual, and in terms of the baptismal rite, symbolic exorcisms, casting out of evil, casting out of demons. And so you have this notion of casting out evil from one's ears. There's the three monkeys. Hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. So two of those can be a source of the interplay of human life with evil. Hence the demon possession issue. So when Jesus is doing this sort of, sticking fingers in ears and spitting into the man's mouth, this is a form of exorcism. As well, perhaps it was also some kind of folk religion thing going on. But what the church picked that up with, and in the interpretation of that, was that Jesus is actually casting out demons by doing these things. He is sort of erecting an obstacle to evil. And in fact, then the scripture says, immediately his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. This is a story, like the story that precedes it, of restoration, of being made whole. And that's the key to understanding the healing miracles of Jesus, all of them. That it's not about the individual healing, the individual disease or impediment that is being overcome. It's about making the person whole so that they are once more restored to full human function, that sense of wholeness. But because if someone was possessed of evil or a demon, then you were also pushed aside from society. So all of the healing miracles are about healing the body, making the body whole again, an integral human body, but also restoring the individual to society, restoring the individual to family and friends, restoring, in the Jewish context, restoring the individual to synagogue. So they were no longer pushed to the edge. They were no longer marginalized. And this is where we then look for the deeper values in these particular lessons. Tom hit on one, which is this notion of there is no, as Paul would then articulate, there is no Jew or Greek, there is no slave or free, there is no male or female, there is only life in Christ Jesus. So that there's that piece of it. And then there's and of course the demon is cast out of the woman's daughter. And then here directly, the quote unquote demons are cast out of this man. And all are being restored to human wholeness in terms of their physical reality, but they are also being restored to their social bodies. Comments?
Yeah, to me, it's very true.
I hope.
Yeah.
This whole thing is an incredibly important part of the beginning of Christianity, and we've thought that Mark wrote only to the Jews, and the Jews we're going to receive Jesus as a prophet and be just another Jewish sect, all of a sudden we're told, no, that's not the case. What I'm doing and what I'm talking about applies to everybody,
Yes.
no matter who they are, the bottom to the top of society.
Right. See, and that is a theme, and that's why this is why it's sometimes important to know what order things were written in and what era in which they were written in terms of a time frame. Mark is considered the earliest written, or the earliest of the written gospels that are canonical. So basically, we're getting the earliest understandings within the Christian community of what the teachings of Jesus were and what their implication was. It gets refined with the other ones. We talked about Matthew before, last year through our study here. And that was written primarily to Jewish people and so on, and a lot of talk about the kingdom of God and the restoration of the kingdom of David and all that stuff. So the themes were there, but you see, if this is the earliest one, that means that all of these themes have somehow need to be read into, if they're not explicit, they need to be read into the work of, say, Matthew and Luke and Paul. This is why, in one way, it's important to see what some German scholars did in the early part of the last century when they cut the Gospels up into little snippets. And what they do is they pasted them one next to the other. And this is called the Q theory, that basically there were two principal sources for the later Gospels, namely Matthew and Luke. And those sources were Mark and other material that came from somewhere. Some have, there's some evidence in terms of the linguistic analysis of so on that there might have been something like a collection of the sayings of Jesus or something like that. But in terms of a narrative, Mark forms the foundation for the other two Gospels. And for John in many ways, but John is so much later and so much more refined from a theological point of view that, it sort of stands on its own in many ways. But Mark is, a foundational document for the Christian church. So George, you hit exactly correct what's happening there. So the themes of the universality of Jesus' mission, the theme of, there is no, as Paul picks it up, to reiterate what Paul said, there is no Greek or Jew, there is no slave or free, there are no distinctions among humans when it comes to the grace of God. That these themes were already extant right around in the Christian community at the time that Mark was writing. And Mark incorporated them into his narrative to make the points. Kathy.
Yeah, and you have to sit back and think about how earth-shattering that was.
Yeah.
Because it was the first time you ever heard people getting outside of their little clan. The Jews were a tribe and the Syrians were a tribe, and talking about a wider, that a universality that, as you mentioned before, that was just kind of really earth-shattering. And
right. Well, you have to stop to think again. If Mark is being written within, some say as early as 65 AD, others say, well, a little bit later, but around that time, that was the time that Paul was doing his missionary work.
Yeah.
So he was out and about, in Corinth, in Thessalonica. He was in the region that's called Galatia. He was in Asia Minor. Then of course later on he was in Rome, and so. And while he's doing that, of course, he uses as his base of operation the local synagogue, because he's a Jew's Jew, as he sort of, again in Galatians, makes the case. But at the same time, what he's doing is moving it beyond the synagogue into this wider view. And there are people who are attracted to this message that is essentially what we call gospel, small g, the message of Jesus, the way of
Yeah.
Jesus.
And it never
So-
really,
Go ahead.
it never really hit the Jews. It never really stuck with the Jews that much. It stuck more with the Gentiles. And
Well, only because there were more of them, I think.
well, that could be true too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there were a lot of Jews coming over,
Mhm.
as it were, being converted. Certainly not all of them. Otherwise,
Yeah.
there would be no Jewish remnant. But that's what Matthew's gospel. Remember, we talked about that in Matthew's gospel, that essentially Matthew is really struggling with how the Jewish leaders, the synagogue leaders, pushed the Christian sect, George, as you kind of described it a little bit, pushed the Christian sect out of the synagogue. And so now what do we do? And so that's where he coins the word ecclesia in Greek. He doesn't coin it. He uses the word ecclesia, but he coins it as a reference to the church. So the church becomes its own group, its own tribe, as it were, its own people. But already we're incorporating not only the Jews of Palestine or of the diaspora Jews in all over the world in the synagogues, but also Gentiles. They're already being incorporated by the time Matthew's gospel is written. And it is this teaching of Jesus that we get as foundational in the Gospel of Mark, and that we then see sort of the practical implications and also some of the other related elements of it in Paul's teaching. That this now moves away from an emphasis on Jesus only to an emphasis on the church, on this community of faith, on this community of love. And that's where James is going, you see, because if you divide the community, if you have these prejudices between powerful and not powerful, between rich and poor, you are dividing the community and you will destroy the church. So that the church, the ecclesia, which is the word we get, in the Latin languages, ecclesia, in French, église, and in Italian and in Spanish, more like iglesia, as far as church, both as building, and if you capitalize it, it's the church community. Or we have the English words ecclesiastical or ecclesiology. That's all from that term. But that's one level, one tier above where Mark is. Mark is simply getting to the point, again, just the facts, ma'am kind of guy. He is the Joe Friday of the Gospels. He is just saying, this is what Jesus taught us. We also need to kind of take into account a little bit, because it's sort of current thinking, what we've referred to a few times already, what Marcus Borg refers to, that essentially almost the entire Gospel of Mark can be capsulized in the last week of Jesus' life. So this walking around that Jesus does, this peripatetic mission that he has, is going to not only is he telling people don't be nasty to the Gentiles, he's actually going into their territory. And the narrative puts him in what it is he's now, going around doing this, and he's eventually going to return and go back to Jerusalem and there face his final fate. Kathy.
You might know the distances better than I do, but just looking on, the rough maps that I have, could that have been done in a week?
Yeah, kind of, sort of.
Or sometime close in a short period of time, maybe not necessarily a week, but
yeah. Well, we say the last week because that's the notion of the Sabbath, the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
So there's all kinds of Jewish imagery that's being employed there in the narrative. But he makes a compelling case for it, actually. The book is called, I think, The Last Week. And it's fascinating. I used it as a Lenten study when I was at St. Mark's. And people were like, oh, this is really interesting, because the stories do fall into a time pattern if we look at them carefully. And they do have, if you actually start to map out, well, this happened here, and this happened here, and this happened here, you do begin to see this sort of geographical tie as well. He's not flitting from one thing to the next.
No, yeah.
Remember a couple of weeks ago, he was in a boat and he took a boat ride,
Yeah.
across the lake, so that was a quick way of getting from one place to the other, storm or not, kind of thing. You're just going to do it that way. So here we are in the 7th chapter, which is about the middle. When we get by the 13th chapter, we're already toward the end of the story. So just in terms of time frame, we're sort of in the middle of everything right now. Anything else about that lesson? I'm not in church on Sunday, so I'm going to be interested to see what Mary has to say about it. She was in the office the other day. We were on Wednesdays. We always sit and chat for a bit, and we were talking about the lessons. And he said, and she said, "Oh, these lessons for the weekend," because you have the James lesson, which is powerful, and you almost need to address it a little bit. You have these two stories together, which follow each other in the gospel pattern. And then, of course, Proverbs, which we didn't even look at. But, it's these three lessons kind of fit together in a way that make it a very challenging opportunity, both to preach a challenging sermon or homily, as well as, just the challenges that are within the lessons themselves.
Well, we're in a period in our own lives where people are saving each other's lives or trying to.
Yeah.
And with a hurricane making everything even worse, and that we are being given a lesson in helping another human being as being a fundamental thing of Christianity.
Yes.
And that we all can partake of this or encourage this in ourselves.
It focuses our energies as well. Missioners will always say this, that you cannot preach the gospel to people with empty bellies. So the thought is always take care of their physical needs first, and then their hearts will open, not because you were kind to them, but because now the anxiety, the worries, just the physical feeling of being hungry or cold or without a home and so on, that these things need to be taken care of before people can even begin to really seriously think about this thing we call faith.
Maybe we should think about that with what's happening to the people in Afghanistan now that we're gone. They will be starving to death within days.
Yes.
And to help those people may go a long way towards helping an entire region of the world calm down.
Yeah.
If we ignore them or desert them, we're asking for it.
Well, I think that there's one reason why, or there's two things going on. That as of the news of yesterday, as I was listening to, our government still is saying that they will deliver humanitarian aid. It will be through the United Nations agencies or other NGOs, which are still on the ground there. There are other, non-governmental organizations, the Red Cross or Red Crescent, depending on what, we're talking Christian or Muslim. Those are international organizations. Yes, Doctors Without Borders, Nurses Without Borders. There are a number of them that have been there for years, are still there. Because the concern is that if the government gives the money and the resources to the government, you're just encouraging the continuation of the corruption that was the problem in the first place. So while we have left there militarily and at least temporarily diplomatically, there are resources that are being channeled to the people of Afghanistan, and absolutely it is our moral obligation to do so as a nation. And I don't mean that simply because we're a quote unquote Christian nation. We have a, strictly ethical, moral obligation to take care of these people. Because we made them dependent on us, and then we left them. It's like, a parent leaving children in a building all by themselves and never coming home, and then expecting them to feed themselves and to protect themselves and to learn and all of that. So the NGOs now become extremely important. So supporting them in any way that we can. I don't know if ERD is there on the ground. I'd have to actually look at that. But or CRS, Catholic Relief Services, or the Episcopal Relief and Development organizations are there. I'm pretty sure they have a presence there. So that would be one way that we could do that. Of course, then there's, Oxfam, and there's, as Doctors Without Borders and all those kinds of things. Apart from that, even though, there's the old thing about these organizations have been gutted over the years because they were not been funded. But USAID, it used to be that you would send all of this food and goods to take care of these kinds of needs, and of course you made very sure the American flag was emblazoned on the side of the container or anything, so people knew there are Americans taking care of you. So that was kind of making people sort of morally indebted to us, or at least that's the theory behind it, so that they would like us, and then if they like us, they'll like our government, that kind of thing. But then, we do other wacky, immoral things, which were rife. I mean, that's one reason the whole thing did fall apart, is that we never allowed the people, I'm kind of going off on a tangent here, allow the people to be themselves, to be their own people. We tried to make them Westerners. And these cultures, we're talking about biblical times, these cultures have been around since before biblical times. And they do not change simply because, democracy is wonderful. Let's do that. There was a very interesting report from a special forces officer that I listened to within the last couple of days. And he was describing how there was the regular Afghan military, which, of course, looked like American soldiers. They had American uniforms, American style uniforms, American guns, equipment. They were trained in the way American troops are trained and so on. In terms of infantry troops, and then there were the I don't know what you would call them, the
Special
Navy.
forces.
No, they weren't special forces.
They weren't, but they were more like the guerrilla.
Yeah, they got to wear their traditional clothing. The military advisor basically used their internal power structure, to organize them and to, put them into larger operations rather than trying to make them something that they were not. And I think that's, I don't want to say it's directly related to what we were talking about today in the scripture, but this notion of even the argument that Paul was having with Peter and James, in the time of writing his letter to the Galatians, everybody's trying to make all the new Christians Jews first. And he said, no, you can't, don't do that. Allow them to come to their own conclusions and then live out their faith. And hence you get this universality of the church, which was actually particularized in history by having different rituals. I mean, we kind of have a remnant of that today with the Orthodox churches, capital O Orthodox churches, that they still worship in the language and in form that they did centuries ago. That was also true even of the Western church prior to the Reformation, like in England. What we had in England, being children of the Church of England, was what was called the Sarum Rite. For example, we kind of implement some of that at St. Luke's. The use of the color blue during Advent. The use of the Lenten, what we call the Lenten array. We don't wear purple vestments much anymore. During Lent, we have the unbleached linen, that sort of grayish, and then the decorations are oxblood and black. That goes all the way back to the cathedral at Salisbury. And they had their own rite, R-I-T-E, relative to the rest of the Catholic Church. And that was true in Ireland. It was true in various parts of England. It was true in France. It was true in Spain. In Spain, we have what we call the Mozarabic rite. In Italy, we had the Ambrosian rite. But what happened was, after the Reformation, in response to the Reformation, the Catholic Church got into this idea of uniformity throughout. And so they went and they took the Gelasian Sacramentary and basically did some changes to it and say everybody must use the same one, because the idea was, if you let people do their own thing, they may get their own ideas. And that's that's what they were seeing happening in their minds, the leadership of the time. I'm oversimplifying, but that's kind of what was happening in Germany. So you have the whole Lutheran Catholic division in Germany. The Lutheran Church in Scandinavia looks more Anglican than it does traditionally Lutheran. They even call their ministers priests. So it has, their bishops were miters, and the Lutheran Church, the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, started doing that. That's because of our intercommunion and so on. So they've become more sort of high churchy than probably, Kathy, the church you grew up in.
I was there for part of that growth, but growing up as a kid, the bishop, who's that? We never heard of the bishop.
Right. He was just this guy, someplace else that sent pastors here and there.
Yeah.
The liturgical vestments were minimal, if existent at all. Preaching gowns were used more, that sort of thing. It was kind of a low church approach to things from our Anglican perspective. And even the Oxford movement in the 19th century in Anglicanism, which was a recovery of quote unquote Catholic roots within the Anglican Church, that all of that was in part a recovery of this sort of homegrown Christianity. So that the Church of England in Henry's day, it was the Catholic Church, except the king was the head of the church, not the Pope. And then it was through the Elizabethan, the rest of course, you had the back and forth with Mary and that, but finally in the Elizabethan period and then into the Edwardian period, that it kind of takes on a whole new character, because the reform movements of the continent start Edward first rather, start influencing the theology and the ecclesiology of the Church of England. But eventually it kind of comes back to the Elizabethan settlement, and it's kind of quasi-Catholic, quasi-evangelical. That's when we get the both and middle road kind of approach to things, because all she wanted to do is keep peace in the realm. And actually, that's how Christianity got its quote unquote boost. That's exactly what Constantine had in mind. There are all kinds of stories about his deathbed conversion and all that sort of thing. Well, conversion prior to that, but his deathbed baptism. He saw this spreading religion because it was an idea more than it was a set of rituals and things, because the rituals could be contextualized within the ethnic and national groups. He saw it as a way of unifying and keeping the unity of the empire. So that's why Christianity got its quote unquote boost when it became the state religion of the Roman Empire. But it has its roots back in these days that we're talking about in these scripture lessons, that there was no need to be Jewish. There was no need to be Palestinian in form. And so you have not only the Jewish diaspora in the empire, but you also have the missionary tasks and travels of Paul, and then these gospels being written to begin to explain, using the teachings of Jesus, of how this can be. So in a sense, they're theological reflections on the work and ministry of Jesus. Well, that was a big
And
circle.
there we have the history of the world.
There you go. Right. In 5 minutes or less.
Yeah.
Of course, then after that, Christianity became, pretty much the religion of the West. And of course we were anti-Semites to get rid of the Jews, and we were anti-Muslims and make sure that they kept where, they should be, which is the Middle East, because we couldn't control. We had the Crusades to try to get rid of them altogether, and that didn't work. So then you eventually get into the rapprochement of the three religions, within the 20th century, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this has a lot of implications. These little tiny stories have manifestations throughout the world in one or another way. And so that's really kind of interesting to me. Well,
Have you been watching the news a lot this morning?
not this morning so much. A lot of the news was about the issues in the Texas legislature.
Oh God.
And
Oh.
it was beginning to do the same thing over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Okay, well, you might want to turn something on. There's horrible flooding
Oh, in Philadelphia.
in Philadelphia and
New
New
Jersey.
Jersey and
Yeah.
New York City.
I did see that they did have some reporting on New York. In fact, Bill Cairns, I was watching MSNBC to be honest, and Bill
Well-
Cairns was talking about the neighborhood he grew up in.
We might have been watching the same thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that they had never had flooding like that there. So
Yeah, the parked cars have water up to their ceilings,
yes,
up to their roof,
Right.
in these Philadelphia streets.
Right.
Incredible. They've never had that.
Right.
It was raining 3.5 inches an hour.
well, they said
Never
that
had that.
this turned out to be one of the, if not the wettest day in the history of this region, of our region.
Yeah.
So the difference with Agnes was it lasted over 2 days. And so it was a sort of collection that came down the Susquehanna over time. It's still, apparently they're saying the Susquehanna will not flood. It will not reach flood stage, but it will be very close. So it still remains to be seen because there's no rain in the forecast right now. So that's a good thing,
Yeah.
unlike Floyd. So
Yeah.
Now, a question. You have recorded our session this morning. How would someone else want to look at this over again?
well, once I figure out what to do, there will be links to it. So
Right.
it will probably be uploaded to YouTube and then a link put on the web page.
That'll be good. That'll
Yeah.
be good. No,
Yeah.
okay.
So I think we're onto something that maybe some people might actually start coming. Some more people might start coming.
Yeah.
Get a chance to say, what do these people talk about? This thing. And what I'll do is I'll edit some of this chitter chatter at the end here out. Some people. I can do that once I get the recording from Zoom.
Okay.
So.
That'll be good.
Okay, folks, we'll let you go. Next week we will not meet.
Oh,
And I didn't want to delay cancel this week in lieu of next week again, because next week is Father Jerry's funeral at 11 o'clock.
oh yeah.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
So we'll be busy with that. So we'll see you in 2 weeks. 2 weeks hence, we'll be back to our regular schedule.